Welcome to the Parts Party. I'm Adriana.
And I'm Ella.
And this is your invitation to hang out with us and our beautiful guests as we explore the lived experience of internal family systems. We want to share in our common humanity as humans who have multiple parts within us, so we can show you what it really is to honour this model of therapy in our own lives. This is a place for IFS nerds, therapists, enthusiasts, or just anyone who wants to get to know their parts and their self a little better.
So grab a soft drink for your little ones, a tea for your manager parts, and maybe something fancy for your firefighter parts. Because all parts are welcome.
So, Ella, do you want to introduce yourself and let us get to know you a bit better?
Yeah, I am a therapist in private practice in Cairns in far north Queensland. I specialise in sex and relationships, and for my individual work, I'm an EMDR consultant and absolutely obsessed with the internal family systems. I find it such a beautiful way to work with my clients, but also personally as a human to experience myself in the world. On a more personal level, I love doing yoga, hiking, fitness, hanging out with my partner, reading books. Yeah, that's kind of me. What about you, Adriana? How would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a counsellor also in private practice, and I work with individuals and couples here in the inner west of Sydney. I'm a very person centered therapist, and alongside IFS, I'm trained in brain spotting and emotionally focused couples therapy. But my main love has always been IFS. It's just a beautiful model. And something that people may not know about me in the therapy world is that before becoming a counselor, I was actually a sculptor and creature effects artist in the film industry for almost 10 years. So it was a very different creative job, completely different to the therapy world, but it was a lot of fun. Once I started this path of therapy, though, I was kind of a goner. I would spend most of my time sculpting in a workshop with my headphones in, listening to therapy podcasts, just immersing myself in this world until eventually I made the jump, and here I am now.
That's it, isn't it, Adriana? The personal and the professional kind of meld into one. I think when you're a therapist, there's just so much to learn and it becomes really a way of life.
Absolutely. So, Ella, we first met at our IFS Level 1 training, and then this was kind of your little brainchild that you approached me with. So, I'm wondering if you wanted to speak a little about what your inspiration and ideas were around creating this podcast with me.
Well, there is already a lot of internal family systems podcasts out there. And I really enjoy listening to, particularly there's a few of them that I listen regularly to and all the new ones that come out. And I've noticed they have got the experts talking about the model from a little bit more of a expanded point of view. And I'm always so fascinated and curious when I hear people that are really experienced in IFS talking about their own parts
Mm.
and how they kind of connect to self in their own way and what that means for them in their lives. And that's what I'd love us to talk about. So, something a little bit more personal from the perspective of sitting in the client chair rather than for therapists sitting in the therapist chair. I hope that our podcast will be interesting for everyone.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with all of that. There are some amazing podcasts out there, but I think something that got me really excited to say yes to doing this with you was really using this space to speak to the lived experience of IFS. As you said, not just as therapists, but as clients and humans ourselves. It's kind of our opportunity to share in our common humanity as humans who have multiple parts within us and really demonstrating how we've learned to honor that in our own lives. And that's both successful and sometimes unsuccessful or imperfect, how we interact with our parts. And just honoring the humanity of that as therapists, we have our own parts too that we get in conflict with. So if we can really model that to our listeners, And yeah, by really creating a space for us to talk about how we experience and work with our own parts, and how our guests that are experts themselves, how they work with their own parts, we can hopefully deepen other people's experiences of IFS and what it can bring them in their lives
Mm.
too.
Yeah, that sounds really fun. And listeners might not be aware, to learn the internal family systems officially, there's a level one course that's taught over multiple weeks, over a period of time. And we did ours together, and we're in the same little reflection group. So outside of the learning and the practicing, we got to come together with a facilitator, and there was one other beautiful woman in the group. But I just remember, like, we could have talked forever. And so I thought, just, ideas going here, there, and everywhere, just really vibing on the excitement of talking about this stuff. And I think that really inspired me to reach out to you particularly as well.
Yeah, so I think you and I are aware that some listeners might already be all over IFS and have maybe read every book and know all about it. Whereas for others, this might be something that's completely new. So I want to make some space here, given that it's our first episode, to give a bit of an introduction about what IFS actually is. And I want to kind of preface this by saying I have some parts that are a bit hesitant or wary to do this because it can be a tricky thing to explain. And there is a whole IFS Institute in Australia who have their own ways of speaking to that. And I really want to honor their expertise compared to mine. And at the same time, I have a part that really wants to give it a go because this is about our lived experience for the model, as you said. So I'd like to speak for how I see and experience IFS when I work with it. And hopefully that'll help give some context to our listeners for what on earth we're talking about half the time as well.
Yes.
So, what Ella and I decided to do, because speaking about what IFS is like a whole episode in itself, was to just do a little bonus content separate to this episode where we can each share our own little 10-minute introduction to what IFS is that listeners can go and listen to on their own. And with that in mind, maybe for just right now, as we're talking, Ella, we can kind of speak to maybe the common threads we heard in each other's descriptions. How does that sound for you? What did you notice in both of our descriptions of IFS?
I actually expected them to be a bit more different.
Mm,
And we covered really similar things, actually. What I really enjoyed hearing in yours was how we develop as humans to be self and a system of parts. I think lots of people think it's all quite imaginal and fanciful.
mm,
And the way that you set it up to really understand how we come to be multiple in this way made it really grounded
mm.
and not just sort of a metaphor. Mm.
Yeah, beautiful. And yours spoke to that in a very similar way, as you said, kind of honoring how we do have that self and then how these parts kind of start to develop their own little roles and where they get assigned, use that metaphor of some of them having to be in the basement and some of them kind of coming to the surface. It's just a beautiful language there to start understanding how parts develop and then how we start to interact with them as adults who kind of maybe forget that our mind is multiple.
That's right. And that piece as well, that they're all just trying to help, I think is
Mm,
probably the most important part of the internal family systems. We struggle because we're fighting internally with parts of ourselves. And Richard Schwartz, who created the model, wrote that book, No Bad Parts. And when you can really recognize even the most challenging parts of ourselves or someone do have good intentions deep down, even if they're being super critical, it's such a transformative perspective.
yeah, absolutely. I remember when I was introduced to IFS by my own therapist many, many years ago, and something about this notion of parts just made inherent sense, like not just to my mind, but to my body. In the therapy room, we're often working with feelings that are arising in the body, right? Or some issue that's coming up. And usually it's something that we want to change about our lives or get rid of. And IFS allows us to put that experience into this framework that says, hey, there are these parts here that make up the mind. And there's actually one calling out right now via this sensation or via this behavior. And what would it be like to pay attention to that right now rather than try to make it go away? And suddenly, this avenue opens up, like you said, that allows us to actually communicate with these parts and get to know why they're showing up in the way they do. And that can bring so much more compassion to whatever's going on inside. It becomes less like we're seeing the part or the issue as the enemy. And instead, we operate from this new assumption that sees our parts, like you said, they have pure and positive intentions. And we can be curious and say, okay, what's this part trying to protect me from? What's it trying to tell me? Or what's the story that it's carrying? And how can I help it feel witnessed in that story that it's been holding on for so long? And when we start to befriend these parts, a lot of that tension that we're holding around the original feeling or issue can often start to soften on its own because we're inviting so much more support and harmony to our system as a whole. We've made space for it to exist, which means we've also made space for it to be supported. And the parts don't have to act out then in such loud ways because then they're being listened to.
Exactly. Yeah.
Hmm. So, one key concept in IFS is the notion of tormentors and trailheads. Ella, would you be able to tell us a bit about what they are and maybe give us an example from your own life?
Sure. A trailhead is a starting point. So, if we want to do a little bit of work with our internal system, how do we get in? Where do we start? So, we look for a point in the trail to start, as if, like, when you're hiking, you would look for the little flag that starts the trail and takes you up to the hill. There might be quite a few points you could start with and get to the same lookout. We need to look for some energy, something that's activated to know where to start. So that could be a situation that upset us or activated us in some way, a body sensation, or anything at all, just a way in.
Hmm.
And a tormentor is a concept from Richard Schwartz. So, obviously, a mentor is someone that can guide and coach and support our growth. And so, a tormentor in IFS is someone that has challenged us, that provides us a wonderful trailhead to take us to a piece of work that can really help us to heal.
Hmm.
In my life, I have tormentors and trailheads all the time that I bring to therapy. One that I can share was almost a year ago now. I was down in the Gold Coast for the EMDR conference, and I actually had the chance to speak about bringing in the internal family systems together with EMDR to heal sexual challenges. So it was a really big deal, and I was networking. And back at home, I was sharing an office for over a year before that with a social worker. She was in the office next door. And being a sex therapist, I have on the communal toilets, I put on the ones that were traditionally the ladies' toilets, I just put two cubicles and a menstrual hygiene box. And on the one that were traditionally the male toilets, I just covered the male and put urinal and one cubicle and just had arrows. And for a year, it was totally fine. And it's really important that I create a safe space as a sex therapist. I encourage people to come and see me that are questioning their gender or maybe gender fluid or trans. So this was a really important part of what I offered to people in my space. And when I was down at the EMDR conference, I got an email from this person, this social worker, and she said, I've taken down the signs. There's a parent that's complained. She'd started seeing children clients, and I was really triggered because I didn't have a lot of capacity to really respond because I was in the middle of getting ready to speak. And, there was like over 300
Mm.
people I was about to speak to. It was a really big deal. So I just really asked my parts to make a little bit of space and tried to just write a super professional, but like, please hold off on making any decisions like that until we can talk when we get back. And then I couldn't really talk to her. She was in session. I was in session when I got back. And there was two main parts that were super activated. So I have a manager that I call Justine, and she is really concerned with justice, with me standing up for myself. And she writes like angry emails in my head when something's going on. And then I also had another part that is around 9 years old, and she just wants to be friends with everybody, really doesn't like conflict, just really likes to sort of play nice and people please a bit. Uh, and so these two were really in a bit of tension. Justine wanted me to really go to town and tell her to be a bit more considerate, and Justine was really angry when we go there. But the 9-year-old was really holding me back. So I did a little meditation and I just really asked them to make space. And I eventually got to talk to her and we kind of worked something out. But I thought that was a really helpful tour mentor to just look at, well, this isn't just me standing up for myself. This is me standing up for my clients and doing a bit of growth so that 9-year-old and Justine can work together. And so it doesn't have to be attacking anyone, but it also doesn't have to be staying quiet in a way that affects me and my business and my clients.
Hmm. And that brings in something interesting that I think about, which is where the name of this model of therapy comes from, internal family systems therapy. And you just kind of demonstrated what that's about, right? We have an internal family of parts. And just like in a family system, in family therapy, you might have what gets labeled as the problem child or the golden child, or all these different members of the family have these roles that they play out, and it can cause either dysfunction or harmony. And what I'm hearing is that the 9-year-old and Justine were these two members of the family that were kind of at odds with each other. They were having this conflict. And we kind of sat down and did a little bit of internal family therapy with them, where both of them were not only trusting of yourself having their back, but they started to trust that they can cooperate with each other a little bit more. The 9-year-old doesn't have to interrupt Justine as much or stop Justine as much. And Justine doesn't have to bulldoze over the 9-year-old's concerns all the time either in order to get what Justine wants. Yeah, that's a very interesting demonstration of how it actually works inside.
Yeah. And what about you? Is there a tormentor or trailhead that you're comfortable to share about?
I feel like I'm communicating this really messily, Ella. I might um I might have to record it myself maybe
Oh,
when I have my
absolutely.
thoughts organized. I'm totally not in self energy. Sorry,
Yeah.
Ella.
No, that's okay. No, you can record it and slice it
Yeah,
in.
exactly. So I decided to leave that little bit of audio in that you just heard to point to the fact that a trailhead literally came up for me during our recording. And to give some context as to why, this is a new experience for me. I've never been on a podcast before. I haven't done a lot of public speaking. I'm very used to speaking within the more relational environment of a therapy session with my clients. But I have a very strong perfectionist inner critic part that gets activated when it's presented with the idea of putting myself out there for possible judgment by a larger audience. It really wants me to come across as competent and eloquent in the eyes of others. And this perfectionist part copes with that anxiety through a kind of counterintuitive strategy of putting me into a bit of a dissociative frozen state where I can't think clearly or get my words out or come across competently at all. And that happened right here and now in the podcast. So, this is a growth edge for me that is indicating some healing and some work that I've got to do with myself. And maybe at some point I'll be able to speak to that with the gift of hindsight after having gone through that journey of growth. But for now, the best course of action was to honour that part, give it a little bit of space, take the pressure off, and give myself permission to drop that question and move on to the next one while I was recording with Ella. And so I've added in here a separate recording of what I actually wanted to share with Ella about a tormentor that I have worked with in the past. Enjoy. I think what keeps playing in my head right now is my experience of relationships and how understanding tormentors and trailheads really helps shift that for me. So, in my teen years and early 20s, I had a lot of relationship anxiety. And so, my romantic partners were kind of my biggest tormentors. And I think this is really important to talk about because, as couples therapists, we both know this is often true for most people. Relationships can provide us opportunities for our greatest healing, often by being our greatest tormentor. So, what this looked like for me was that I had this part that had a lot of anxiety and insecurity around whether I'm safe in a partnership or not. It would be preoccupied with a partner's behavior and would get triggered by any signs that they're maybe not interested in me or don't want me anymore. And it would become this perpetual cycle or loop within me of just having this anxiety coming up and getting triggered, and then feeling like I need the partner to fix it, or I'd start to question, am I in the wrong relationship? If I'm feeling this way, are they the problem? Am I the problem? And then all that would set off my partner's parts, right? And they'd react, and on the cycle would go. And fortunately, I've now done so much work with my own therapist and with myself, and I've gotten to know these parts, both the anxious one and who it was protecting, that innocent exile that was holding on to painful beliefs and experiences from childhood around not being wanted. And both these parts have been able to be held and supported in a way that that anxious one no longer has to act out in such extreme ways. They can now trust that I'm there, that they can feel secure in relationships because they're secure with me. And that's an ongoing process, of course. It's not linear, it's not perfect. But I think the most important takeaway for me is that through those experiences that I've had, it's now given me a whole new perspective on what to do when a trailhead shows up, or when my partner is being a bit of a tormentor for me now. So even if it still sucks and it isn't easy, the therapist part of me kind of gets a little bit excited because now I see it as this trailhead that takes you to a piece of work that can really help you heal, as you said. It's like, hey, I could get caught up in the story. I could get wrapped up in that cycle again with myself and my partner. Or I could see this as a sign for me to go inwards towards this part that actually really just needs my attention. When anxiety comes up for me with a partner now, I see it as maybe 10% to do with the other person or the situation, and usually 90% is actually pointing to something unhealed or divided within me. And that's been really liberating for my relationships. I no longer have to be so preoccupied or fixate on the other person. I can go, okay, before I decide to have this conversation with my partner, can I have a conversation with my parts first? And then I can still bring it to the relationship afterwards if that still feels necessary. But oftentimes it's like the charge has been taken way, way, way down. And it makes it so much easier to then tackle that 10% that does have something to do with the relationship without it being compounded by all the other stuff within me that was lying beneath it that had nothing to do with the relationship. And this will be a constant process that keeps happening because the nature, as I said, of relationships is that they give you the most opportunities for growth, the most opportunities for healing by your partner, unfortunately or fortunately, being this constant tormentor that brings a mirror up to you so that you can find your next trailhead.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think relationships are a space that really brings up our stuff. We can do a lot of work, but until we test it in the wild in our relationship, we don't really know if it's stuck, if it's landed, if our parts have really settled and started to trust self to lead. So, something else that is really key to the internal family systems is the idea of self energy or being self led. And we both touched on that in our introductions. But I'm wondering, Adriana, if you want to speak a bit more to this concept of self and how you experience it or how you conceive of it.
Yeah, so as we kind of both spoke on in our introductions, self is innately whole, innately healed, and it kind of just is okay with everything. It's this thing that compassionately holds connection to everything that is. And that sounds a little bit lofty, but at the same time, once you get it and you connect to it, you can really feel what it is to be held by that kind of self presence.
Mm.
So I had an interesting journey to self. I think I conceived of it before I had experienced it. And that's a common story that I find in a lot of my clients as well. And a lot of people on the spiritual path as well often have this conception of what self or awakening might look like versus what the felt sense of it actually is might be lacking, or we just might not actually have experienced it just yet. And I remember it was maybe a year or two into my own personal therapy when my therapist started to bring in more of an IFS framework in her work with me. I found it actually really hard to connect to this notion of self. And if I was working with a part that was really active and blended, it almost felt impossible. It felt like, no, 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 I cannot let self in. I cannot let go of this contraction, this holding that I'm doing. I can have this idea of self, but don't you dare get me to invite self in. It's almost like the parts had these concerns or these ideas about what self actually was. And it felt like a threat to them. Even, as beautiful as this concept of self sounds, sometimes to parts, it sounds really scary. It sounds threatening. What do you mean there's this larger self that can just hold me and love me, but I've got this message or this story inside that that's not possible, or if that's the case, there's no purpose, there's no role for me to serve in the system, and therefore I'll disappear. There are all these fears that parts can have around this notion of letting in self. And I had a lot of parts then that judged that experience as well. At the time I was studying to be a therapist, I one day wanted to be an IFS therapist, and I'm like, but I got to experience self. Come on. But with that, I just had to kind of soften into the process, into realizing that these parts had some concerns about self. They didn't know, they didn't remember what it was like to have self hold them or be in their presence. And they kind of had to soften to that idea and be listened to and not be rushed in the process of trusting. And when I eventually did have an experience of self, it was just kind of this, I'm kind of hesitant to put words to an ineffable experience, but it's
Mm.
just this lightness of being, this presence, just kind of this stillness is there that's just able to hold them without them needing to do or be anything other than they are. It's this unconditional presence, grace, compassion that allows parts to be held.
Yeah, yeah. That word grace, as soon as you said that, I felt a little more self energy come into my system. That, for me, that word really resonates as part of self energy, that it's not something that we can get more of or practice. It's a grace that comes. And
Mm.
I think you bring up a really important point there, that when we've had a fair bit of experience with working with our own system, we often talk about IFS as being lovely and how wonderful to be self led and how gorgeous to be in self energy when we're blessed with moments of a lot of that. However, it can be really challenging. It can bring up
Mm.
really difficult feelings, and it's not always an easy, or it is gentle, because that's really part of the model, that it goes as slow as the protectors want it to be. But it's not always fun for people, especially when they first begin and the exiles are holding a lot of pain before they've been unburdened. So I really appreciate you bringing that aspect in.
And just a little nuance regarding the language that we often use, where, say, I had an experience of being in self energy. And I just wanted to highlight that self is who we really are. It's always there. We can't get away from it. And we have experiences of self energy when we realize that, when we identify with who we really are. And when we're identifying with parts, we're still self. It's us. However, it feels like we are just the parts when they're totally blended.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that in here. It's such an important nuance. What about you, Ella? How do you think of self? And has that experience of it changed for you over time?
It has changed over time how I would talk about it has changed over time, but ultimately the experience is the same.
Mm.
But parts of me don't feel very comfortable trying to describe self because it is an experience. And as soon as you try and put
Mm.
words on something so indescribable, it kind of reduces it somehow. Or I might be talking from a blended explaining part that wants to stand up and know things, which feels a bit off as well. I really love just that simple phrase, the you that's not apart, you that's there when there are no problems to solve. Ways of talking about self that hint to what it is rather than trying to say what it is.
Mm.
One of my spiritual teachers is Muji, and he had the most beautiful example. He said, imagine a precious jewel that has many, many different facets, many different sides, and each little facet is totally unique. And behind them is the same precious jewel.
Mm.
And I love thinking about self in terms of my drop of self, my facet of that jewel, which may have a uniqueness, perhaps a bit of a sense of a life path, and then the greater self, the jewel that is the oneness, a bit like I'm the drop and the ocean is all of self. So a lot of my practices of dropping into self are going into that oneness, however that might be conceptualized. I really enjoy losing a sense of identity and kind of merging with a greater self. So there's some of the ways that I conceptualize self energy.
Beautiful. I'm curious if you've noticed a difference between when you relate to parts from self and from another part.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So in my 20s, I did a lot of spiritual practices. And a lot of that was, I would have moments of self, of oneness, but a lot of those practices were really led and pushed for by some spiritual manager type parts doing the work. So there was a sort of contraction around that.
Mm.
And the framework of the internal family systems has allowed me to be very nuanced in recognizing who's in the driver's seat is a part acting as self.
Mm.
And when one of my main managers, I call her Nancy, is relating to parts, she's very good at organizing and supporting the other parts, but there's a bit of a rushy energy. I do like naming my parts, and she's named after Nancy from Stranger Things. And so she's a bit neurotic. She's always helping out all the littler characters in the show. And she can get, really quite high strung at times, but she's also a real badass. She can take on some of those demons. So yeah, when she's bossing the parts around, I can sort of feel the contraction. But she's really helpful as well. It's though learning to make a little space. So I'm not coming from her, that I'm coming from self and I'm connecting to the little ones.
Mm. Yeah, that's beautiful. And it's a really powerful image just to notice that little contraction that comes in when you're connecting from a self like part or a part that wants to be in the driver's seat. But it's kind of like, oh, if I can just maybe control these other parts, and you can feel that contraction. Whereas self is kind of this spaciousness that allows them in and they can just soften into that space. It's a very different quality, but can be subtle to notice at first.
Yeah. Is that the same for you? Because yeah, very much for me, I've learned to somatically check, like, oh, who's sort of running the show right now, and I can feel it in terms of what my body and breath is kind of doing. Is that the same for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely get this contraction. I don't have a Nancy per se. I definitely notice a part that wants to force healing.
Mm.
It really wants healing for me. And it goes, well, if I can just get you to accept self, if I can just get you to soften, then everything will be okay. It has this, in quotations, compassionate, altruistic agenda, but it's still an agenda. It's going, I really care about you. I want you to all soften and heal, but I'm going to stay contracted unless you do that.
Yes.
And that kind of stops it from happening.
Yeah. Bless
Mm,
those parts. They want so
yeah.
much for that healing. But counterintuitively, the more they push and struggle for it, the more they often prevent that. Mm.
Yeah. And sometimes they just kind of need that space to be held and be what they are as well. It's this kind of counterintuitive, paradoxical nature of letting go. We want to let go of these parts, and the healing ones, especially, like, if you could just let go, but I'm going to hold you until you let go. And it's almost like letting go of the fact that even this part is unwilling to let go,
That's right.
and just having it be okay as it is. And in that's where there's that little bit of spaciousness that self can fill.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of that
Mm.
saying, hurry up and meditate, that sort of joke,
Yeah.
that push to relax.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Yeah.
it's been really lovely to talk all about the internal family systems with you, Adriana. I'm curious if maybe we can do a little parts check in now that we've done our pilot, had a chat. Are there any parts you've noticed that are really present? Is there anyone inside you that needs some attention right now?
Yeah, I think what struck me and is really telling is that even when we're doing a podcast about parts, we can have parts that are getting in the way, that are really loud and clear and totally not with self at the time. And life happens. I had some stuff going on just before this that brought up a whole slew of parts. And I'm just noticing that they're taking my presence away a little bit in this moment. And instead of maybe making that a bad thing, I've got some inner critics that absolutely are saying some things in my mind about what it means if I'm not fully present whilst doing a podcast about IFS. Instead, I'm just creating a little bit of space for that to be here too. There are parts that are going, I need your attention. It's maybe not safe for me to be fully here in the moment because I want you to think about other things. And I'm just kind of letting them know, hey, I'm quite somatic when I work. So I'm even just wanting to put a hand on my heart to the part that's kind of been calling my attention and go, hey, we did it. We got through it. And I'm going to be here for you. We can do both at the same time. I'm still present for you.
And that's so important, isn't it? It's self and parts. It's
Mm.
being self led. It's not trying to kick our parts out of the room so we can just be in self. I often think about an incredible Indian saint. Her name was Ananda Mayima, and she was just had a lot of times just fully in self, in ecstasy. And she couldn't eat. She couldn't. Her
Mhm.
disciples had to like take her to the toilet and spoon feed her because she was just in this state of absolute bliss. And so we
Yeah.
need our parts. We can't talk and do a podcast if we're in that state. I don't know what would happen. So really welcoming those parts of you that
Mm.
have other information that they're holding and other important things going on. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. How about you? What parts have been coming up for you?
I've just had a really nice time actually. It's been really lovely just to share about this stuff and to reflect a little bit on our journeys and how we got to this point. So yeah, maybe that's a bit of self. I'm feeling, a lot of just kind of openness in my chest and warmth in my heart and just care for you that you're so passionate about this stuff and want
Mm.
to do it so well, like there's a lot of love and
Mm.
that sort of connection feeling as well.
Yeah, I'm definitely got this little glow kind of emanating from my face and my heart, kind of this inner smile that's going, yeah, we were able to share in this moment together. And maybe I'm sharing in a little bit of your self energy, and that's allowing mine to kind of come out of hiding a little bit. It's being remembered.
Yeah, self is a bit contagious, isn't it?
Hmm.
You can kind of catch it off each other a little bit, which is really nice. Yeah,
Yeah.
lovely.
So, as a bonus as well, at the end of our episodes, we'd really love to offer a meditation or an opportunity to explore IFS for yourself even deeper. So, as an offering for our first ever episode, we've got a Connecting to the Eight C's of Self meditation that I wrote a couple months back. So, feel free to explore that and see how you find it for yourself. and how you experience self and parts.
And we thought it would be nice to end each episode with a little quote, a poem, something that inspired us. And Adriana, you've got a beautiful offering to share.
Yeah, the one that comes to mind for me today is what Mike Elkin shared. People are afraid to go inside because they think they're going to discover something horrible about themselves. The good news is that's impossible. The bad news is it's really hard to convince parts that that's impossible.
Thank you. That's very much what you shared, isn't it? Relating to your journey with self energy. That really fits, which
Yeah,
is really
absolutely.
gorgeous.
Yeah,
Yeah. Thank you, Adriana.
my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for being part of the Parts Party with Adriana and Ella. We hope you enjoyed being with us, and we wish you many moments of self-leadership. We'd love your support by liking and subscribing, and we hope to see you next time.